London Calling. The crowd is preparing to demolish the Houses of Parliament with trench mortars.
Welcome to a special centenary episode of the British Broadcasting Century podcast, when we look back exactly 100 years ago today to broadcasting the Barricades, the first radio scare via fake news, a drama masquerading as news.
Intercepted by the crowd, roasted alive, hanging the Minister of Traffic.
Normally on this podcast we tell the moment-by-moment origin story of early British broadcasting, which sees us in November of 1923. We'll continue there next time, but we can't let a centenary go by. Perhaps the most famous early radio broadcast was War of the Worlds, originally written by H.G. Wells, dramatised by Orson Welles, no relation, in 1938. Scared America. Well, 12 years earlier, the BBC was doing something rather similar, thanks to Father Ronald Knox, who alarmed Britain by broadcasting these words.
The Savoy Hotel has now been blown up, preparing to demolish the Houses of Parliament with trench mortars. Greenwich time will not be given this evening by Big Ben, which has just fallen to the ground.
So that was 100 years ago today. No recording, so on this episode we will dramatise it for you. We do love a dramatisation of a lost broadcast on this podcast. And our guest, Dr. A. Brad Schwartz, author of Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News. He'll tell us all about Father Ronald Knox and broadcasting the Barricades, which occurred on this day in 1926 at the other end of this British broadcasting century.
Hello, this is Paul Carenza calling.
This is London Calling.
Hello, this is Guildford calling. It's Paul Carenza here, your host on the British Broadcasting Century podcast. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year to you. It's 2026, but on this episode, we're going back to 1926. We've been out of our regular timeline for a couple of episodes now. We're trying generally to keep it chronological, which lands us in November 1923. And join us next time. We'll pick up the tale of the first British broadcast armistice, all building up to the BBC's first birthday. But this episode, we're looking at broadcasting the Barricades of 1926, and last episode, we were in 1922, looking at the first radio drama, as retold on today's BBC Radio 4, in my own radio drama, The Truth About Phyllis Twigg. If you've not heard it yet, it's on BBC Sounds, and I believe you can hear it internationally, so I'm told. And it's had some lovely feedback from people who've enjoyed it over the Christmas period. So if that's you, if you've listened, if you've fed back to us, if you've fed back to the BBC, even better, thank you so much. And huge thanks to the wonderful cast and crew and B7 Media for bringing that tale to life. And while on the one hand it's just lovely to be commissioned to write a thing for today's BBC and have it on the air, my overwhelming feeling is it's great to just have justice for Phyllis, because as we explained on the previous episode, and indeed in the drama, for many years she's been overlooked. So we're delighted to get that on the BBC today. And indeed it is a massive team effort, as we said last time. Academics like Professor Tim Crook and Dr. Tina Pepler and countless others have all been part of telling this tale. So justice for Phyllis has hopefully been achieved, but the story continues. I'm working on the biography with Phyllis's great-granddaughter Karina, and we're even starting to develop that radio drama for a sister medium. Television, maybe, we'll see, or not. Two extra little things I wanted to give after last episode's rather mammoth behind-the-scenes tale of the truth about Phyllis Twigg. One of them was a bit I meant to say, and I completely forgot to, was a deleted scene we had in the middle. Well, it wasn't a deleted scene, it was a truncated scene, but I had one little scene full of Easter eggs where we explore possible Christmas dramas that Phyllis Twigg could have written. I think we had a couple of instances that stayed in the final edit, including a flying snowman and things like that. The original version of that had, I think, 10 or so different future Christmas dramas. We had a joke about getting all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. We talked about a vicar having lots of Christmas dinners. That's a nod to Vicar of Dibley, of course. We had the Jolly Boys outing. There was a reference to that. Only Fools and Horses. Oh, many others too. But I remember trying to defend that as we were recording it, when the actors were looking at me and going, so why is it exactly that we're having all these references to later festive dramas? I go, well, it's just a bit of fun. But of course, when you record about an hour's worth of content for a 45-minute slot, some things have to be sacrificed on the altar of radio entertainment. So that scene largely bit the dust. I think it's still there in part anyway. So that was a bit of fun. The other thing I wanted to say, I was really, really curious to look online to see the responses about the drama, especially what did we get wrong I'm always fascinated by that. The only comment I've seen was Andrew Barker, newspaper detective, friend of the podcast, who noted that the 3 minutes interval in every 10 minutes that we included on the drama, or The Truth About Phyllis Twigg, that actually that was dropped on the 18th of December, 1922. So by Christmas Eve 22, there would have been no 3-minute interval. Instead, it was replaced by a 5-minute interval in every hour. Well, I can neither confirm nor deny that that completely passed me by and I should have realised it or not. Either way, it was, as Andrew Barker says, artistic licence. And it was really nice to be able to sort of hint at that side of the early broadcasting tale, as well as give an opportunity for Phyllis Twigg to be utterly baffled as to why they're stopping her drama 7 minutes in to have 3 minutes of radio silence. It's a thing that they did have back then, but maybe they stopped it a week before this first radio drama. Thank you, Andrew, for spotting that. Appreciated, and well done you. Have 10 British Broadcasting Century points. And if you collect 100 by the end of the year, you get a novel. I'm working on it. Meanwhile, this episode, 1926, 100 years ago today, the BBC gave their first radio scare in this rather bizarre and wonderful drama that came from the Edinburgh studio. It was a quarter-of-an-hour report of a murderous riot, Savoy Hotel torched, Big Ben toppled by trench mortars, National Gallery aflame, the Transport Minister lynched on a lamppost. The BBC itself, the mob was heading their way, and it panicked listeners. From the 16th of January 1926, broadcasting the Barricades, or in its written form, A Forgotten Interlude, was by Father Ronald Knox. To introduce us, our guest this episode, author of Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News, Dr. A. Brad Schwartz.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful.
Great fan of the show.
Oh, well,
you're
too kind. I'm a fan of you listening to the show. So thank you. That's very... So as you know, then, we like to delve into particular niches of broadcasting history. You've brought a niche which is actually not too niche in a way, because I've seen it described as one of the most well-known portions of early broadcasting history, this wonderful viral fake news origin story of War of the Worlds, and indeed its British counterpart.
You're right. It's something that has been a milestone in American broadcast history, and I think known around the world, and indeed had international ramifications. But it's something that people referred to, but often didn't fully understand. And I had the great good fortune. The book, as we're talking about it, is 10 years old as of yesterday.
The book's full title, or the subtitle, Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News. So that, I think, tells you all you need to know.
I just always have to point out that fake news did not mean what it meant when the book came out, because the book came out in May of 2015. Donald Trump announced he was running for president in June of 2015. So I ended up riding the crest of that wave simply because, I put that phrase in the title. And for a long time, when you went on Amazon and searched for fake news, this was what came up. It began as my undergraduate thesis at the University of Michigan. And the subtitle at that time was something like Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, Fake News, American Democracy, and the Golden Age of Radio, or something like that. So it was the interplay between fake news and democracy. That was from the very beginning. That, as I say, I didn't, people after this would ask me for lottery numbers and things like that, because clearly I had some predictive powers, but I really didn't.
Did you give Trump the idea? That's what I really want to know. I think maybe.
Well, he claims to have come up with that phrase. He gave interviews later on and said, "Well, nobody knew this great phrase, fake news." And I was able to say, "Well, here it is in the title of the book, right?"
You heard it here first. Yeah, look at
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So shockingly, he lied apparently in that.
Oh,
instance.
that's a first. Okay, so let's get into the fakery of the newsery. There's two elements: broadcasting the Barricades and War of the Worlds.
There is some argument that the former influenced the latter.
We will save Brad's insights into War of the Worlds on American radio in 1938 for a future episode. For now, for this one, we're sticking to its older British sibling, 1926's Broadcasting the Barricades. The Edinburgh station boss, George L. Marshall, knew of Father Ronald Knox before. He lined him up for what was described as a talk, but was really a drama. But George Marshall did warn listeners at the very start that the statements of Father Knox were
not to be taken seriously.
There's an opening announcement that identifies what this is as a joke. But if you tune in after that, you really only have your own sense of humor to tell you that this is not real.
So what do you think? Would you have been caught out by this?
Bang, bzz, reached its perfection in Gwaith Elegy. The distinctive note, then, of 18th century...
It began then at 7:40 p.m. on the 16th of January 1926, live from the BBC's Edinburgh station,
within a very limited range of...
simultaneously broadcast to about half of the BBC stations.
The French Revolution...
Dundee, Cardiff, Bournemouth, Glasgow, and crucially, given its impact, in London,
domination of those conventional ideas...
where it began with a spoof lecture, as if we join it part-way through.
Admit much that was regrettable in that movement.
The script, written by its original performer, Father Ronald Knox, included every single speech impediment you hear, every word and
of literary values
is there in the script.
Higher sense of the possibilities of human achievement.
So this was a pastiche of an academic lecture. Clearly Ronald Knox had heard this sort of thing on the BBC and wanted to give it a good skewering. I don't know which broadcaster he's specifically mocking, but I'm sure that someone back in the day would have heard his broadcast and felt rather affronted. The Dundee Evening Telegraph noted,
"The first trace of humour was the way he cleared his throat." A prolonged cough, followed by silence. London Calling. That was Mr. William Donkinson lecturing to you on 18th century literature. Mr. William Donkinson. We're now continuing the news bulletin since 6:30.
in fairness, it began fairly mildly.
The test match.
To begin with, Ronald Knox was just seemingly reading the news, a bit of sport and a bit of weather.
The closing score when stumps were drawn in the test match was as follows. Australia, 569 for 7 wickets. The English team were all out for 173.
Nothing to alarm anybody, surely.
Plucky Waterman saves life at Chiswick.
So who was the writer and performer behind this then? Ronald Knox was once called the wittiest man in England, and he is the wit who once said,
"A good sermon, like a woman's skirt, should be short enough to rouse the interest, but long enough to cover the essentials."
Ronald Knox is a fascinating character in and of his own right. Catholic priest, detective fiction writer, member of the Detection Club with Agatha Christie and all the great writers of the Golden Age, author of The Viaduct Murder, among other things.
and in 1928 he listed what are now quite famous 10 commandments of detective fiction, stating the rules of whodunits.
The other piece of satire that he's really well known for is this essay called Studies in the Literature of Sherlock Holmes. It was a parody of the higher criticism, and he's sort of applying biblical higher criticism to Sherlock Holmes stories, and this then inspires the movement that persists to this day to read the Sherlock Holmes canon as factual writing, which he was very upset about. But he's a satirist, but he's also a satirist who has a history of being too clever for his own good.
17, Sunbury Place, Chiswick. The little one is believed to have fallen into the water accidentally while playing. The unemployed demonstration. The crowd in Trafalgar Square is now assuming threatening dimensions. Threatening dimensions are now being assumed by the crowd which has collected in Trafalgar Square to voice the grievances of the unemployed. Mr. Poppleberry, the secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, has been urging the crowd to sack the National Gallery. The desirability of sacking the National Gallery is being urged by Mr. Poppleberry, secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues. 1 minute, please.
You and your audience will understand, I think, more than when I have tried to describe this to American audiences. The way he's parodying the unflappability, the structure of a news, how you read the news once in the active voice and once in the passive voice, stuff like that.
London Calling. Continuation of news bulletin from reports which have just come to hand. The crowd in Trafalgar Square is now proceeding, at the instigation of Mr. Poppleberry, secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, to sack the National Gallery. The National Gallery was first erected in 1838 to house the famous Augustine collection of pictures, and has been considerably added to since. A new wing, designed by Mr. E.M. Barry, R.A., was added in 1876.
Those odd explanatory notes, like someone had mixed the news with Wikipedia. Again, he must have heard an announcer do this, and then exaggerated it when he thought it ridiculous.
It contains many well-known pictures by Raphael, Titian, Morello, and other artists. It is now being sacked by the crowd, on the advice of Mr. Poppleberry, secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues. That concludes the news bulletin for the moment. You will now be connected with the band at the Savoy Hotel.
There are news reports very soon after this suggesting that some portion of the audience was taken in by this as being a real news broadcast.
Hello, everybody. London Calling. You will now be given the weather report for tomorrow. The weather report for tomorrow now beginning.
He comes away from the mob story and keeps returning to it. So Stick with it. It's slow at first,
Generally,
but it
with
snowballs.
occasional showers in the south and a continuous downpour in the north, the wind will be violent in England, and in Scotland will probably assume the dimensions of hurricane. High tide at London Bridge, 7:15. That was the weather report for tomorrow. Continuation of the news bulletin.
The Dundee Evening Telegraph said,
Father Knox was emulating the efforts at spoof announcements adopted last year by Scottish students.
it seems that his target was a very specific type of reportage.
The Test match. The latest weather reports from Australia announce that a light rain is falling, and the wicket will probably be somewhat sticky when the Australians take the field tomorrow morning. The unemployed demonstration. The crowd is now pouring through the Admiralty arch and is advancing towards the back of the government buildings in Whitehall in a threatening manner. The Admiralty arch is being poured through by a crowd, lately collected in Trafalgar Square, and the back of the government buildings in Whitehall is being approached in a threatening manner. The Admiralty arch, designed by Sir Aston Webb, was erected in 1910 as part of the National Memorial to Queen Victoria.
It's very British humor, more clever than jokey, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is 1926. The Russian Revolution is not that far in the past. The general strike in Britain is not that far in the future. It's only a few months later.
One moment, please.
So this idea of an uprising is very much in the air.
The crowd has now collected in the neighbourhood of the artificial water in St James's Park and is throwing empty bottles at the waterfowl. Empty bottles are being discharged by the crowds at the waterfowl on the artificial water in St James's Park. So far, no casualties have been reported. That concludes the news bulletin for the moment.
Some London listeners headed to the streets not to see for themselves, as much to get out of the capital. A few journalists went to Whitehall to take a look and left baffled.
There had not even been a drunken brawl.
The Weekly Dispatch started to get frantic phone calls, but they had no tip-off from the BBC this was going to happen. The results of this seemed to be rather underestimated.
Sir Theophilus Gooch, well known for his many philanthropic schemes, will now address you on the housing of the poor. A lecture on the housing of the poor will now be delivered by Sir Theophilus Gooch, KBE, of the Committee for the Inspection of Insanitary Dwellings, and speaks with authority on his subject. Eh? What's that? 1 minute, please. From reports which have just come to hand, it appears that Sir Theophilus Gooch, who was on his way to this station, has been intercepted by the remnants of the crowd still collected in Trafalgar Square, and is being roasted alive. Born in 1879, Sir Theophilus Gooch entered the service of Messrs. Goodbody, the well-known firm of brokers. He very soon attracted the notice of his employers. However, nothing was proved, and Sir Theophilus retired with a considerable fortune. His retirement did not mean idleness. He has been prominent during the last 10 years on many committees connected with social improvement. He is now being roasted alive by a crowd in Trafalgar Square. He will, therefore, be unable to deliver his lecture to you on the housing of the poor. You will be connected instead with the Savoy Band for a few minutes.
The Daily Herald, 18th of January 1926.
Listeners heard that a lecturer who had been expected to broadcast would be unable to come as he had been burned to death. Hastily rushing to the nearest telephones, listeners poured inquiries into the BBC, newspaper offices and the news agencies. All these, except the BBC, were puzzled, as Whitehall was as quiet as ever it is on a Saturday evening. They inquired of the BBC in their turn.
I think even the BBC were quite puzzled, because Edinburgh knew what was going on. Those at the London station were pretty much as in the dark as the newspapers were. The duty announcer was Stuart Hibbard.
I was on duty at Savoy Hill, and as Knox was speaking from Edinburgh, I did not listen at the beginning, but soon so many phone calls from apprehensive listeners were coming through that I had to listen. Hello, everybody. London calling. Continuation of news bulletin. Famous film actress arrives at Southampton. Miss Joy Gush, the well-known film actress...
London announcer Stuart Hibbard thought that...
Obviously, the whole thing was a spoof. You only had to listen to sentences like, "The mob are now swarming into Hyde Park and throwing ginger beer bottles at the ducks on the Serpentine," to realise this. After all, it was night and bitterly cold, with ice and snow everywhere in the London area. But still, the telephone calls came in.
It was early days for many
Miss
listeners.
Gush said she had a capital crossing. unemployed demonstrations in London, the crowd has now passed along Whitehall, and at the suggestion of Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, is preparing to demolish the Houses of Parliament with trench mortars. The use of trench mortars for demolishing the Houses of Parliament is being recommended by Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement.
A South Londoner said,
I looked across at my daughter and saw that she had turned deathly pale. The existing Houses of Parliament was begun in 1840. The designs were those of Sir Charles Barry. The structure roughly forms a parallelogram, 900 feet in length by 300 in width. The internal decorations, frescoes and statues are deservedly admired. The building is made of magnesian limestone from Yorkshire, a material which is unfortunately liable to rapid decay. At present, in any case, it is being demolished with trench mortars under the influence of Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement.
as far away as Berwick-upon-Tweed near the Scottish border, listeners
Left their sets and spread the news through the town. 346 feet high, respectively. The clock tower, 320 feet in height, has just fallen to the ground, together with the famous clock, Big Ben, which used to strike the hours on a bell weighing 9 tons. Greenwich time will not be given this evening by Big Ben, but will be given from Edinburgh on Uncle Leslie's repeating watch. Uncle Leslie's repeating watch will be used for giving Greenwich time this evening instead of Big Ben, which has just fallen to the ground under the influence of trench mortars. One moment, please.
JCS McGregor there in the studio said,
The whole thing was a skit on microphone mannerisms. The leg to be pulled was the BBC's, not the public's. The joke miscarried, but it threw a vivid light on the English sense of humour. You will wonder how the BBC dared to make a joke again.
yes, this could have been the end of BBC comedy.
Fresh reports, which have just come to hand, announce that the crowd have secured the person of Mr. Wotherspoon, the Minister of Traffic, who was attempting to make his escape in disguise. He has now been hanged from a lamppost in the Vauxhall Bridge Road. One of the lampposts in Vauxhall Bridge Road has been utilised by the crowd for the purpose of hanging Mr. Wotherspoon, the Minister of Traffic. The crowd is now returning along Whitehall. One moment, please.
There were phone calls to higher levels too, to the Admiralty, demanding the Navy be sent up the Thames to stop the rioters. The Mayor of Newcastle pondered resorting to emergency plans. Maybe he thought his city would now be next, or whether it might even be the new capital. Sorry, Newcastle, it's not to be.
The British Broadcasting Company regrets that one item in the news has been inaccurately given. The correction now follows.
The dark humor, one of the lines is something like, they report that the Minister of Transportation, I think, has been hanged from a lamppost.
It was stated in our news bulletin that the Minister of Traffic had been hanged from a lamppost in the Vauxhall Bridge Road.
And then they come on and say, no, it's actually a correction. It was a tramway post.
Subsequent and more accurate reports show that it was not a lamppost, but a tramway post, which was used for this purpose.
Not a lamppost. That's the joke, right?
A tramway post, not a lamppost, was used by the crowd for the purpose of hanging the Minister of Traffic.
Which I think is funny, but at the time probably, would be more alarming than anything else.
The next 3 items in our programme are unavoidably cancelled. You will now be connected up with the Savoy Band again.
He kept cutting to the Savoy Band, as London 2LO often did, until he couldn't cut to the Savoy Band anymore because they had been blown up. In the original broadcast, it was the sound of an orange box being destroyed by JCS McGregor, the sound effects man on standby in the studio.
Hello, everybody. London calling. The Savoy Hotel has now been blown up by the crowd. That noise which you heard just now was the Savoy Hotel being blown up by the crowd at the instigation of Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues. One moment, please.
The Savoy Hotel themselves were quoted in the Daily Chronicle, 18th of January 1926.
We had hundreds of serious telephone inquiries from all parts of the country. Calls from Ireland, Scotland, Manchester, Newcastle, Hull, Leeds, many other places. We must have had over 200 local calls. People wanted to know whether it would be necessary to cancel their rooms. Some made anxious inquiries as to the safety of friends staying at the hotel.
Presumably the first sigh of relief came when they heard the phone was answered amid what could have been the ruins of the Savoy Hotel. A public statement from the Edinburgh station said,
Of course, we regret any alarm that may have been unintentionally caused, but if the public was deceived and really thought the Savoy Hotel was falling down, it means the sound effects produced by the engineering staff here were remarkably realistic. I think we're entitled to regard the whole thing as a compliment to ourselves.
JCS McGregor was rather pleased with the complaints, said it showed that his sound effects had done a good job.
The more unruly members of the crowd are now approaching the British Broadcasting Company's London station with a threatening demeanour. A threatening demeanour is being exhibited by the crowd, which is now approaching the BBC's London station. One moment, please. Mr. Poppleberry, Secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, with several other members of the crowd, is now in the waiting room. They are reading copies of the Radio Times. Good night, everybody. Good night.
The question's asked, is it true the House of Commons is blown up? Is the National Gallery sacked? Is the Savoy Hotel blown up? What's happening in Trafalgar Square? What's happened to Big Ben? These are listeners phoning the BBC asking these questions in a bit of a panic. So the satire, some may have appreciated it, some may not have done. What do you think then, in terms of to what degree this was something that really had the nation panicked? Is it the press reporting panic and then amplifying it further still? Who can say, or can you say?
Well, it's harder to say definitively in this case than with War of the Worlds, just because there are fewer sources that I'm personally familiar with. On the one hand, as you know, broadcasting is so young. I mean, at this moment,
The BBC was just over 3 years old. Most homes still did not have radio sets, and some were getting it just for the first time. One West London listener told the Weekly Dispatch,
A few days ago, I presented an old couple with a wireless set. Tonight was their third encounter with the BBC's transmission. They sent for me after hearing of the riot, and it's in the lap of the gods whether their health is not permanently affected by the shock. Scandalous.
this is, as far as I've been able to tell, and I've looked, the first instance of somebody doing a fake news broadcast of any kind, sort of like this. The content of it, the presentation of it is satirical, but not certainly as outlandish as a Martian invasion. So I on the one hand, it's extremely plausible that if people tuned in under certain circumstances, that they would misinterpret it. If they do, as happened with War of the Worlds, calling a newspaper, calling the radio station, is actually a rational response. It's the only way available to you to verify what's coming to you over the wireless. And if the times were as frightening as they were in this respect, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Callers were reassured when they phoned the newspapers that it was all untrue.
London still stands as she did.
But it's very difficult to deny a thing that people have heard is happening. Besides, a lot had stopped listening by then. Some had fled their homes. One caller said,
We've heard it on the wireless. We've even heard the explosions.
In Ware in Hertfordshire, St Edmund's College, a butler's wife fainted. There were other complaints of faints as well. A man phoned the BBC saying his wife, who had a heart problem, had passed out at the news. JCS McGregor takes up the tale.
And when he gathered from me that the whole thing was fictitious, he exploded. What, he asked with some vigour, did the BBC mean by it? Did we realise that we had grossly misled the country and were playing into the hands of the Bolshevists? I was young in the service then, and it took all my tact to dispose of this gentleman and of others who in quick succession telephoned to voice the same sentiments.
Another man, Stuart Hibbard recalled, found his wife nearly passed out for different reasons. His phone call was to ask for a refund for booze consumed.
Sometime later that evening, a call was put through to me from a commercial traveller who told me that he had only just got home after a very long day. He found the wireless switched on, both his wife and his sister-in-law, who was staying with them, drunk in the sitting room, and his best bottle of brandy empty under the table. What are you going to do about it? He inquired.
JCS McGregor.
It was a remarkable thing how many listeners were said to have fainted on hearing the exploits of the Secretary for the National Movement for Abolishing Theatre Queues, and a mob which on breaking into Savoy Hill had settled down to read copies of the Radio Times. Yes, it was an exciting night.
Concerned callers were indeed from far and wide and at top level. David Pat Walker's book, The BBC in Scotland, even reports that the Irish Free State made inquiries through diplomatic channels to discover whether it was true that the House of Commons had been blown up. One call came through from the boss, Sir John Reith as he was then. He wanted to reach Father Ronald Knox, or indeed the station director George Marshall. Well, they were both in the same place. McGregor told them they were dining at the Caledonian Hotel. A call was put through to them there. Their oblivious meal interrupted by the BBC managing director. We don't quite know Reith's tone in that phone call, nor indeed how or whether Father Knox and Marshall defended the broadcast in some way, but either way it was soon agreed that an on-air statement should be read out to clarify proceedings. So soon the home audience who hadn't fled their homes heard...
Some listeners, who heard only part of Reverend Father Knox's talk at 7:40 this evening, did not realise the humorous innuendos underlying his imaginary news items, and have unease as to the fate of London, Big Ben, and other places and objects mentioned in the talk. As a matter of fact, the preliminary announcement stated that the talk was a skit on broadcasting, and the whole talk was, of course, a burlesque. And we hope that any listeners who did not realise it will accept our sincere apologies for any uneasiness caused. London is safe. Big Ben is still chiming, and all is well.
Thanks for the reassurance, BBC. And sadly, Uncle Leslie's repeating watch will not be used for the chimes. Big Ben is doing that for us. A later official statement to the press did express some regret.
Incidents in the course of the skit itself should have served to show its character, but it appears that the warning and such episodes were missed by listeners who came into the talk too late.
Too late indeed. At least the Sunday papers next morning could reassure the nation. Except they didn't, because bad weather delayed newspapers in many parts of Britain that day, so many rural listeners had an extra reason to believe that London had fallen, with no printed press to either tell them what was genuine, or indeed to reassure them that the press was still printing. A few people then called the police, others heard reassurances from their milkmen. Monday morning, 2 days post-broadcast, Reith asked the Edinburgh boss, George Marshall, for the transcript to release publicly. The directions and the sound effects were a bit of a clue, beginning,
"Wireless noises, biz, bang, biz. The indistinct voice of an elderly don is heard in the middle of a lecture."
or sound effects cues like,
More gramophone, which stops suddenly with a loud report.
and the destruction of an orange box. The names, too, were a bit of a clue this was a spoof. Mr. Popplebury. I mean, come on, is there a national movement for abolishing theatre cues? Reith defended that the ludicrous events described and the warning at the start surely meant the BBC had done enough. A BBC statement then said that while
"We have no more stunts of this kind in hand at present, I'm not sure that we shall leave them out of our plans for the future. I feel that the sense of humour of the British people will stand an even more severe attack than this. We did not quite get away with it this time. We take the view that of about 2 million people listening, quite 9/10 saw the humour of the thing. They, of course, remained silent. It was the 10th who missed the joke who raised the scare."
And indeed, the feedback received by the BBC stands up to those amounts. That there were 249 complaints against the BBC and 2,307 praising the broadcast and its inventiveness. Nearly 10 times as many for as against.
Which is exactly what ends up happening with War of the Worlds, where the ratio of letters of praise versus letters of complaint is something like 10-1. So that at least would indicate that more people appreciated what Father Knox did than were upset by it.
So far as is known,
A BBC statement said at the time,
such a misunderstanding has never been created in any other country in which wireless is employed.
"Well done, BBC. You broke radio first." Now, you might think that John Reith, that rather dour, puritanical Scot, was rather anti all of this ribaldry, but actually he was incredibly glad of it. He said it was a fine response and that it showed people were clearly listening to the BBC. He clearly cared more about what listeners thought than what the press or Parliament thought. And as for the press, well, they were quite anti-BBC at this point. So the headlines over the next few days were rather, shall we say, excitable. The somewhat alarmist Daily Express said,
"Terror caused in village and towns, a blunder by the BBC."
Weekly Dispatch said,
"Father Knox scares Britain! ! Last night's Battle of Trafalgar Square. BBC shock. How Big Ben was blown to pieces. Last night practically the whole of the country was seething with sensational rumours of a great red riot."
Manchester Evening News.
"Subjects famous comedians would not countenance. War and wanton destruction. Where is the line to be drawn between harmless and dangerous burlesque? Should this form of entertainment be undertaken exclusively by comedians whom listeners would be in no danger of taking seriously?"
If you can't trust a priest, who can you trust? Dr. A. Brad Schwartz.
As with American broadcasting about a decade later, there is in the mid-20s great friction between the BBC and the British press, as you know.
The Daily News called it
"The biggest scare in the history of wireless."
The British press used this incident, the reports of it, as a club against the BBC, the irresponsibility, you need the newspaper, the more established, trustworthy media, because obviously you can't trust a medium that's going to do something like this.
The sketch said it was a lesson for
People of tomorrow to know better than to assume that anything is news until they see it in print.
Oh yes, trust the newspapers. Ironically, the general strike a few months later would see the press stop printing, and Britain would turn to their wireless sets for news at long last. Thanks to newspaper detective Andrew Barker for so many of these articles, such as the Daily Graphic, who said
The BBC blundered badly in not ruthlessly blue-penciling the bulletin of faked news.
Interesting. Faked news. Meanwhile, the Western Morning News called this
False news.
ahead of its time.
And when you look at some of the news accounts, the English papers will say the panic was more intense in Scotland and Wales. The Scottish papers will say it was more intense in England. As with War of the Worlds, a lot of anecdotal reports, a lot of stories that may have a basis in truth, but are probably being played up. I know this is not something Fleet Street would ever do, of course, but playing it up to discredit radio.
Those who've listened to the podcast know the story well. The printed press versus this broadcast medium, a bit of a campaign in the very early days to do down this new broadcast medium for taking away our readers. So, as you said, the press had a bit of an axe to grind on that, and they still do. I think in Britain today, we see this anti-BBC sentiment amongst some corners. But there's an irony. There's this guy we mentioned a couple of times on the podcast, William LeQue, who was a radio ham, amateur, who claims to be one of the first broadcaster in a way in sort of the early 1920s, 1921-ish, from Guildford. And he was a novelist as well. He wrote a 1906 novel, The Invasion of 1910, in which he wrote about German soldiers marching down Oxford Street and invading London. And he wrote it as if it was a fiction book, but it was serialized. It was printed and serialized in the Daily Mail itself in the newspaper. So you could have read in the newspaper in 1906 about Germans, marching down Oxford Street, all fake news, but it's serialized. And now, 20 years later, the press are complaining that the BBC can't be trusted. They did it themselves, So,
well, and it's less than 10 years after H.G. Wells was publishing The War of the Worlds, and that's serialized. And that's written, we sort of forget now, but that's basically written as a future history book. I mean, it has a journalistic tone and bent to it as he's describing this invasion, playing on exactly those same fears, right, of the coming World War and Britain at sort of the crest of its empire, right? That fear is very much in the air, and people are playing around with it in those ways. And even in America, this would have been decades earlier, but you had the Great Moon Hoax, which is in the 1830s, when one of the New York Sun publishes a lengthy series of articles about how they have this new telescope that allows you to see bat-winged humanoid creatures living on the moon and stuff like that. So this is a phase that media go through in their adolescence, it would appear. And that's something that translates on both sides of the ocean.
The Irish Times put it,
Humour and satire are dangerous implements when they are applied to mankind in the mass. The BBC will be wise in future if it takes no risks with the public's average standard of intelligence.
I think part of the problem was that Father Knox really didn't anticipate any of this because he presumed everyone was as clever as he was and would surely get the joke. One can never predict how an audience will receive what you transmit. As for Father Knox, he relished the nation's response.
Almost electrified to learn that Dundee had rung up to know how much of London was left,
he wrote later that week. The Daily Mirror said,
when next Father Knox broadcasts, we shall expect him to be serious.
In fact, Father Knox was invited back to the BBC, where he gave another parody of a popular scientific talk illustrating the sounds of vegetables in pain. And what of across the Atlantic then? This is from the New York Times.
The listeners in spread the news, and soon the newspaper offices everywhere were bombarded with telephone calls from people anxious to get further details. These offices were kept busy all day today, reassuring frightened inquirers, for the rumours were still circulating in country towns and villages, and the fact that bad weather delayed the arrival of the morning papers was taken by many persons as confirmation that the worst had happened. The British Broadcasting Company is being severely criticised for what is described as a bad joke. Sir Leo Chosa-Money asked his opinion about it, replied, I should not have made a worse joke if I had rung you up on the telephone and announced that I had murdered my grandmother.
And 2 days later, that same newspaper, the New York Times, printed another article sneering at naive British listeners.
Such a thing as that could not happen in this country. We are safe from such jesting.
How wrong they were. 12 years later, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds scared American listeners in a rather similar fashion to how Father Ronald Knox scared British ones. But interestingly, the Nottingham Guardian newspaper actually drew a comparison with H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds 12 years before Orson Welles scared American listeners with that particular story. So this is from January 1926. The Nottingham Guardian described Knox's broadcasting the Barricades as,
"It was like a page from a Wellesian Martian romance, with terror-stricken inquiries from far and near."
There have been ponderings for decades over whether or not Orson Welles was inspired by Ronald Knox's 1926 BBC broadcast. Was he aware of it or not? Well, in the 1980s, Orson Welles told fellow writer-director Peter Bogdanovich,
"I got the idea from a BBC show that had gone on the year before."
Well, it wasn't the year before, more fake news.
"When a Catholic priest told how some communists had seized London, and a lot of people in London believed it. And I thought, that'd be fun to do on a big scale. Let's have it from outer space. That's how I got the idea."
At least that's how he later told the story, in any case. We'll welcome back Dr. A. Brad Schwartz on a future episode to look properly at War of the Worlds.
I think many of the difficulties that we in the United States are dealing with have their roots in how our systems of communication developed. And I always look with great affection and with some envy to the fact that you have an institution that you are celebrating on this podcast that's now been around for 100 years, that for all of its criticisms and all the complaints that have been thrown at it, holds your culture together in a way that we don't really have here. So protect it and keep celebrating it.
Well, my thanks to Dr. A. Brad Schwartz. Also thanks this episode to Jonathan Mayo for some of the newspaper cuttings, Andrew Barker, Andy Wormsley and his Random Radio Jottings blog. Check out the show notes for links to that. Paul Slade's website as well. He has researched the socks off this tale. And David Pat Walker's book is The BBC in Scotland. And of course, you must get hold of Broadcast Hysteria, Orson Welles' War of the Worlds and the Art of Fake News by our guest A. Brad Schwartz. He will return to this podcast, I'd like to think Halloween, maybe this year, maybe next, to talk about War of the Worlds, which was first broadcast on Halloween 1938, scaring Americans in a rather similar way to how things panned out with Father Ronald Knox. Drama masquerading as news, giving one of the most iconic moments in the history of broadcasting. But as we now know, before America's War of the Worlds, there was Britain's broadcasting the Barricades, 100 years ago today. So from war to peace. And next time on the podcast, the first broadcast armistice commemorations. We're back in our regular timeline. We're in November 1923, and for the first time, the BBC has the dilemma of whether and how it could broadcast a silence, the Great Silence, as it was called then, the 2-minute silence. The BBC at this point was just under 1 year old. We're back 3 years before broadcasting the Barricades, because this is your moment-by-moment guide to the start of British broadcasting, and we must continue our chronological tale, as well as leaping forward now again to these centenary moments. As ever, you're welcome to get in touch with the podcast, Paul at paulkerensa.com. That's Paul at PaulKerensa.com. Find us on social media. That's Facebook and Blue Sky. I've left X this very week. So X/Twitter I have exited. So do instead jump over to Facebook. We have a lovely Facebook group, a Facebook page. We're on Blue Sky. I'm personally on Instagram, and I have a mailing list as well if you'd like to be kept up to date with what I'm doing elsewhere beyond this podcast, including lots of live shows, including a brand new one about the early BBC. I'll be doing a Leicester Comedy Festival next month. That's telling the tale of Mr. R.H. Wood, the engineer who brought 4 monarchs to the microphone. So if you're near Leicester, join me for that by all means. I'm also in Norfolk and Suffolk doing my evening of very old radio later this month. And if you are in the United Kingdom and would like the show near your patch, get in touch. All we need is a venue, and we can work out the rest from there. You can support the podcast at patreon.com/Paul Kerensa, and you can hear a little more of our Broadcasting the Barricades reenactment there. £5 a month, and you can cancel whenever you like. And thank you if you support the podcast there. If you don't and would like to support us for free, you can share this podcast. You can rate it and review it. It's a one-man band, because
The British Broadcasting Century is a solo-operated podcast. It's run by little old Paul Kerensa and not today's Auntie Beeve. Original music is by Will Farmer, and our hats are doffed to all of those who've curated and preserved any parts of this early British broadcasting tale.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Dr. A. Brad Schwartz once again, and the many resources and people who have helped make this podcast what it is. Join us next time then for the first British Broadcasting Armistice. This has been Paul Kerensa, you have been you, and 100 years since broadcasting the Barricades scared Britain. This is the British Broadcasting Century,
Which has just fallen to the ground.